that have students in school. It's the end of the year, and I don't know about how it is when your kids were young or with your kids, but at this time of year, we ask questions of our kids that go something like this. So what did you like about this year? And I don't know if it's that there's just a few days left of school, but they just like bubble. Like, oh, Dad, I love everything. I loved art class, and I loved gym, and I loved reading. I even loved school lunch, they'd say, right? And I'd say, well, what are you going to miss, buddy? What are you going to miss about not having school for the summer? And you say, oh, my friends, Dad, my friends, I'm going to miss them. And oh, Dad, I'm going to miss my teacher. And Dad, my son said, I'm even going to miss the lunch lady, right? Right, it's funny, this time of year, maybe it's just that it's the end of the year, they're just euphoric about everything. And we as parents who have kids, we know that, well, it's kind of a unique time because every day after school isn't like that. Every day for our students isn't rainbows and unicorns, right? There are some days when they come home and they're sad or they're mad and they're frustrated, right? You've had those days with your kids. They come home, they're sad, they're mad, they're frustrated at something. And what I've come to find, at least with my two boys, is that when they're mad, they're sad, or they're frustrated, it usually has to do with them feeling left out. With them feeling left out of something. Maybe some of their friends moved up to the next reading level and they were left behind. They feel kind of left out. Or maybe it's something with athletics. Maybe at gym class they were on the team that got beat and they felt left out. Or maybe out on the playground they were picking teams. Their buddies were picking teams for kickball. And my son the other day, he said, I didn't get picked on the team that won. He was mad, right? Or maybe they go into the lunchroom and there's not a seat at the table with their classmates. Or maybe they get on the bus and there's not an empty seat with one of their buddies, right? I find that with kids, with my kids at least, when they get frustrated, when they get sad or they get mad, it's usually because they feel left out. And our hearts kind of break when we hear those stories from our kids because it's like, oh, we wish we could shelter you from that. But of course, we as adults, we also know what it's like to feel left out if we're really honest. If we were to be honest with our kids, we'd say that we, even as full-grown adults, we know what it's like to feel left out. Like last spring, there was a week last spring, it was over spring break, where I bet every hour I received either a picture or a message from one of my friends that was in Cancun or another in Florida. Some of you are in Arizona or California, while I was back here suffering in the snow, right? We know what it's like to feel left out. Maybe a little more seriously. We know what it's like to feel like we're the only one who doesn't have that beautiful house on the perfect lake, right? We know what it's like to feel like our friends have their career that's just taking off, and for some reason we're in this job that isn't going anywhere. Or maybe you're retired and you see your kids or your grandkids and their careers are taking off, and you miss that. You feel a little left out. Or you see on social media that your friends all got together, or maybe you heard somewhere that your friends all got together, and even as adults, you kind of wonder, well, why didn't they invite me? Or you see those pictures of those picture-perfect families who seem to get along all the time. Those families that just make you puke, right? And you always see those families right about the time you're trying to decide which one of your kids you're going to strangle first, right? See, as adults, we know what it's like to feel left behind or left out. And what's interesting about us adults is that there's one place where it seems like it shouldn't be that way, but it is. You see, it seems like when it comes to religion, no one should feel left out. But again and again, when it comes to religion, my experience is that people often feel left out. I mean, you've maybe had this experience. You go to another church and they do things different. They say things in a different way. You go up for communion and it's like, okay, do we have the cups or do we dunk or are we doing that weird common cup thing, right? Or you go to a church and the pastor says stand and you're singing a song and the next thing you know, you're the only one standing. Everybody's seated. And you go, why is this? Or you go to a church maybe like ours and there's this room called Svea, right? And you wonder, is that like a rash? What is Svea, right? Or they talk about this thing called lutefisk, right? And you wonder, why do they talk about lutefisk? I wonder if Jesus ate lutefisk, right? Probably why he died so young. I don't know, right? Right? You know, for some reason, you know this, seriously. When it comes to religion, religion is one of those things where, for one reason or another, it can have this effect that it makes us feel left out, like we're not one of the insiders. Well, we're going to read a story today, and it's the first story of Jesus' public ministry. It's his first day on the job. Imagine him. He's got a fresh suit. He's got his brand new briefcase. He's headed off to work for the very first time, and on his very first day of work, he addresses this very issue, the way that religion can sometimes make us feel left out. Now, do you remember the first day, your first job? Anybody remember your first job? Right? Raise your hand if you remember your first job. My first job was as a paper boy, huh? And I learned a few lessons as a paper boy. Number one, I learned that I cannot outrun dogs while carrying a bundle of Sunday newspapers, right? Dogs are not nice. I also learned that sometimes people aren't nice. People don't always pay their bills. I also learned that the quickest way from one door to another door is not the sidewalk. Right? You cut through the yard. And I also learned kind of a hard lesson one night. I got up in the middle of the night to deliver the papers, and I still had this paper out when I was in high school, and I got out to my car, I sat down in the car, and I realized I'd forgotten my glasses inside. Huh? And I thought, you know, it's the middle of the night, no one's out, nothing's going to happen, I'll be just fine. I put my car in reverse, and that's when I backed right into my dad's midlife crisis car. He had this shiny white Trans Am. Huh? Right? Dad was not happy. But I learned a lesson. Don't be stupid, I think was the lesson. But I learned a lesson. Huh? You see, Jesus, on his first day on the job, he's going to learn a lesson. So Jesus, on his first day of work, he goes back to Nazareth, back to his hometown. Raise your hand if you moved back here to Alexandria after living somewhere else, right? So you're a little more like Jesus than the rest of us, right? So he moves back to Nazareth after being away for a period of time, and that's when we meet up with him. All right, we're going to read the story here. It says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. So Galilee is the region that Nazareth is located in. And news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him because he's the hometown kid. He came back. You remember when he was that little Joseph's son? Now, look what he's doing, all right? It says he went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went in the synagogue as was his custom. And he stood up to read. And I always imagine that it's his first day on the job. So like the rabbi must have been on vacation because he gets to preach this day. And it says the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him, right? It wasn't books, it was these scrolls. And the scroll was handed to him, and he unrolled it, and he found the place where it was written. And everybody would have been excited to hear these words. These were some of their favorite words. It said, "He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight, to set the oppressed free. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." And they would have went, yeah, Jesus, we love that passage. We love that passage. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He reads the next verse, which is about something that they would have sort of forgotten about. He says, God has also anointed me to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And everybody would have kind of went, whoa. Because nobody talked anymore about the year of the Lord's favor. You see, for these faithful religious types, their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents had talked about this thing called the year of the Lord's favor. It was written about in the Hebrew Scriptures. It was this event that was supposed to take place every 50 years. But nobody believed it would ever happen because it never happened. And Jesus talks about, he says, this year of the Lord's favor, I've been sent to proclaim this. See, the year of the Lord's favor, it happened every 50 years, and the year of the Lord's favor had to do with four things. Four things were supposed to happen on the year of the Lord's favor. It's sometimes called the year of Jubilee. You see, land was to be given rest. Any land that was farmed was to be laid fallow for a year. And likewise, if you worked that land, you were to lay fallow too, I guess you were to say. You were able to rest, and God was able to re-cultivate or give new nutrients to the soil. The soil had a year of rest. It said debts were to be canceled on that year of the Lord's favor. If you had a mortgage or you had a car payment or student loans, they were all gone. Raise your hand if you'd like that sometimes. Yeah, right? As you can imagine, people were kind of excited about this, right? It said slaves were set free. If you were a slave, you were set free. And it says the last one was family land. If you had land in your family that you had to sell because of an economic hardship, that land would be returned to you and your family. And as you can imagine, as Jesus speaks about this year of the Lord's favor, people kind of perk up. No one's talked about this in ages, Jesus. This is kind of interesting. In fact, they were pretty amazed at what he had to say. It says, then he rolled up the scroll and he gave it back to the attendant, and the attendant sat down. And then it says, the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And they were fastened on him because you know what happens traditionally after the reading of the Bible passage. They're waiting for a sermon, right? And they're all looking at him. And he's going to get up and give the shortest sermon ever given on this planet. It says, he began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. And he's done, huh? Don't get any ideas, huh? Right? He's done. And when people heard that, they would have went, whoa. Wait. You're telling me that year of the Lord's favor thing, that's happening now? Like my debts are canceled? Like my relatives who are slaves, we get them. You're telling me that's now? You can imagine, they were just ecstatic. It says all spoke. Isn't the Bible so nice? They spoke well of him, right? And they were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They asked, huh? Now you can imagine, they were all just thrilled. They were thrilled. This is Jesus. He's telling us exactly what we want to hear. But as often happens with Jesus, Jesus doesn't stop there. You see, Jesus is their best friend right now. But in 2.3 seconds, they're going to hate him for what he says next. He says, very truly I tell you, he continued, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. And then he goes on to tell two stories. And these are two stories that everybody would have been familiar with. So bear with me here. You have no reason to know these stories. They're stories from the Old Testament. They're stories about two outsiders who were given privilege by God over insiders. There were two people who were given privilege. They were given attention over those religious insiders. It says, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel. There were many of you religious insider types in Israel in Elijah's time. Elijah is one of the prophets. And it said it was a time when there was famine. It says when the sky was shut up for 3.5 years and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of your religious insider types, he says, but to the widow of, isn't that fun to say? Zarephath. Just say it fast. When you don't know how to say a Bible name, just say it really fast, right? The widow of Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And everybody would have kind of went, what are you saying here, Jesus? Because Zarephath was this community that Jews just stayed away from. It was a Greek community where they worshiped gods and goddesses of fertility, of all things. And it was known quite well that in Zarephath, people took part in child sacrifice. And you can imagine those Jews were disgusted by that. But Jesus seems to bring this up to name who this God of ours is for. And it tells another story about Elisha. He says, and there were many in Israel, many of you religious insiders at another time, with leprosy. Leprosy had taken over the land in the time of Elijah, the prophet. Yet not one of them was cleansed except for Naaman the Syrian. What he's saying is, in the time of Elisha, there was this leprosy that came across the land, and many of your religious types, they had it. But God chose not to heal them first. Instead, God healed this guy named Naaman, who was a Syrian. And Syrians were the arch enemy of those Israelite insiders. You see, he tells these two stories to remind those religious types, those that followed all the rules, that this year of the Lord's favor, you're going to have to share that with somebody you're not really used to sharing it with. You're going to be sharing it with these outsiders. And you can imagine they weren't really happy about that. Not all of us like to share. It says all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, they drove him out of town, they took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to... I always think it's interesting. We worship a God who on his first day of work, everybody in his hometown wanted to throw off a cliff. Kind of interesting. You see, on his first day of work, Jesus learned something, just like we learned lessons on our first day of work or in our first job. You see, Jesus learned that those religious types, they made a system that somehow made people feel as though it was a system only for a few. That there were only a few that were good enough. There were only a few that deserved what God had for them. You see, they built a system for those that followed all the rules and that went to church every Sunday. They built a system that was for those that gave and gave and gave. They built a system that was for those who knew how to make hot dish that was just yummy, right? They built a system that was for those who could sing on pitch during worship. They built a system that was for those who know what liturgy is, or for those who know how to sing all those crazy contemporary songs we sing. Right? They built a system that was somehow for insiders. You see, religion, Jesus learned on his first day of work, was built for a few. And what Jesus wanted to make absolutely clear on his first day of work, that religion might make room for a few, but we have a God who wants to make room for you, right? There's a story from the Second World War in France. There were some soldiers who were out in the countryside, and one of their fellow soldiers died. And they were roaming the countryside, and they wanted to give him a proper burial, and they found a church there out in rural countryside in France. And maybe some of you have heard this story. But they knocked on the door of this little church. There was a little cemetery next door. They knocked on the door, and a priest came to the door, and they couldn't totally understand one another because it was different language. He was speaking French. They were speaking English. But they asked him if they could give their fellow soldier an honorable burial there in the cemetery. And that priest looked at them and said, I'm sorry, you can't. Because this cemetery is only for those who are of our Catholic faith. He said, but if you want, you can bury them just outside the fence, over there on the other side of the fence. And of course, they felt a little rejected, but it was getting late at night. They didn't know what else to do, so they went and they buried their fellow soldier in this grave outside the wall or the fence of the cemetery. Well, the story goes that the next day, their entire group, they found out that they were going home. And so they wanted to honor their fellow soldiers, so they went back to the church the very next day, and they looked around. They knew it had been late the night before when they did this, and they were kind of a little out of sorts, and they couldn't find his grave. And so they went to the church door, and they knocked on the door, and the priest answered, and they said, last night it was late when we buried our fellow soldier. We can't find him. Where is he? And that's when the priest said, I couldn't sleep last night. I was thinking about your friend. And this morning when I got up, I moved the fence. See, I think sometimes when it comes to this life of faith, right, this thing called religion, somehow we've got this idea that it's made for a few. You see, we have a God who wants to make room for you. If there's anything you remember today, religion can make room for a few, but we have a God who wants to make room for you. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, tonight we give thanks that on your very first day of ministry,